From Microbe TV, this is TWiP, This Week in Parasitism, episode 163, recorded on December 27th, 2018. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and joining me today here in New York City, Dickson Despommier.
Hello, Vincent, and happy post-Christmas to you.
You too. Welcome back.
Thank you.
And joining us remotely, Daniel Griffin.
Hello, everybody.
Hey, Daniel.
I almost forgot how to start TWiP because it's been a month.
You know, it's interesting. In the last time we talked, which was the last TWiP, Daniel's been to Africa, I've been to Portugal, and you've been to Belgium.
No, I haven't been to Belgium.
I thought you went to Belgium.
Switzerland.
Switzerland. Okay, Switzerland.
Wisconsin.
Wow.
Massachusetts.
Peripatetic parasitologist.
I passed 50,000 miles. I got my gold status. So now I board first.
Excellent.
I get big seats.
Excellent.
It was worth it for a year.
That's good.
Year of traveling. But next year I'm going to Europe 3 times, so I'll get a lot of miles. Dan, you have a good trip to Africa?
I had a fantastic trip.
Welcome back.
Yes, it was, the travel, it was a long trip. It was 36 hours from door to door.
Whoa.
So I had to first fly from New York to Amsterdam, from Amsterdam to Rwanda, from Rwanda to Entebbe, which is in western Uganda.
We know where that is.
and then it was, there've been some movies. And then it was 10 hours by land to get to eastern Uganda by the Kenyan border where I would be working.
Wow.
And it took a little bit longer because my driver was Muslim. And there's the 5 prayers. And so we had to stop at random places periodically for him to pray. I was trying to talk to him about the concept. A friend of mine, Arif Darcy from Tanzania, he's Muslim, but I guess Indian descent. But not that matters. What matters is Arif does something called double prayers, because sometimes when I've traveled with him, you'll be on an airplane or something. So he'll have certain times of the day when he can do double prayers instead of the 5 separate prayers per day. But no, my driver was having nothing of that. So that added an hour at different points. But it made it very interesting because we would stop in these random little places and he would go off to the mosque to pray. And I would do a little bit of exploring. And
interesting.
So it takes an hour each time to pray?
Yeah.
Wow. That's devotion, man.
So
is it also is that an ablution thing as well, or not?
So I don't think it was quite an hour for the entire, but it was sort of an hour from the time he would drop me off to go to the temple and then come back. Wow. I don't know the answer to your question, Dickson.
Okay.
But you probably brought back some cases, I guess, right?
I saw the busiest day. I saw 140 patients. So I was. The days were long and very busy. So I saw a lot of stuff.
What was your patient total you were there for 2 weeks, right?
I was there for 2 weeks. So it's over 1,000 patients. It was a lot.
Good evidence.
Because you're working 6 days a week. Mm-hmm. We did take a Sunday off. But no, the rest of the time it was just seeing patients from early in the morning until everyone had been seen.
Wow. Did you do vaccinations and stuff like that as well, or?
So the clinic where I worked was really just acute and chronic care. Okay. The organization has an aspect of it where they go out and do vaccinations, but I stayed in the acute care setting.
All right. Can you give us a hint as to what the dominant illnesses were that you were looking at?
No, because these might be cases that come up.
Fever of unknown origin.
He told us before he left that mostly would be AIDS patients, Dickson.
Actually, it was interesting, and I'll throw this. People are probably interested in this. So this area in Uganda still has a fairly high rate of HIV. About 10% of the population in this district are HIV positive, and Uganda's done quite well. In general, I think they've dropped their rate from 18-20% down to less than 10, maybe 6% nationally. At least that's some of the numbers I've seen. This area maybe not as good as the national average. But, Initially, I thought I would be spending a lot of my time in a hospital type setting, but I actually ended up not in the HIV hospital, but actually in a clinic, which meant I saw a much more diverse range of things.
Got it.
But it was the tail end of the rainy season, so you can imagine what things become common and were still present.
Yep.
It's also an area where young boys suffer from what I have mentioned is my son's greatest fear in life, and maybe there'll be a case of that.
Right.
But there was also just everything: pneumonia, acute diarrhea, trauma, minor surgery type thing. So,
right,
whole plethora.
Right.
So, Daniel, my dad was a physician, and he moved to the U.S. in 1950, right? And he did a lot of residency and stuff here, and he started his practice in 1960 in the U.S., and then he would periodically go back to his small town in Italy, which is in the mountains, right? Very rural. And he would see patients, right?
Mm.
And he said they would bring him chickens and milk and so forth for payment.
How about drums of cheese and stuff? I would take some of that.
I mean, he said, I don't really care, but they bring me food.
That's very Italian. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, the nice things, this organization, this was, again, I was working with FIMRIC, who I've mentioned before, Foundation International Medical Relief Children and Families I put in because there were adults as well. But they provide all the services and the medications pretty much for free. The only exception would be the one I say, and families. The adults have to pay would be the equivalent of 20 cents U.S. Money to be seen. But no, all the children are being seen for free. All the medicines for the children, etc., all for free, which is critical because a lot of these areas, if that wasn't the case, they would not be able to pay.
No, and how do you support that organization? Through crowdsourcing or annual fundraising?
So the couple organizations I work with, Floating Doctors and FIMRIC, get the main amount of their funding through two ways. One is people are donating, so supporting them as a charity.
Sure.
The other is they have a lot of students, medical students, nursing students.
Oh, very good.
And they'll volunteer their time, but they'll also contribute. So it's a combination.
Got it.
All right. When's your next trip?
It's funny. In a couple of weeks, I head off to Glasgow, and
that's hardly tropical, but
the manager of the clinic there said, "Oh, that's great. Do you think you'll get a chance to work in some of the small clinics in the outlying villages of Scotland, just like you're doing here?" And I said, I don't think I will. No, Panama is my next tropical trip.
Right. So in Glasgow, a lot of them suffer from single maltosis.
Yes.
All right, so let's go back a month plus. It was November 21st.
Let's do that.
From their case, Daniel, remind me what we have here.
Yes, we had a woman in her 30s, born in Palestine, moved to New York, and she had presented to see me in my office, my private practice, because she had an issue with a sore throat and swollen lymph nodes. And then we'd gotten a little more history. We sort of walked everyone through this. And she had married a man from Lebanon. And he actually goes back quite a bit to see family. She also reports that she had gone back to visit with him 3 weeks before the onset of this illness. And when there, she had eaten this special raw meat dish that is apparently the thing to do when in Lebanon. And I think I threw in that even though he'd gone back many times, he had eaten this most of his life growing up. She had never really been talked into doing it before. And she was making sort of a big deal of this once I identified that she was not vegetarian. And she was saying, at the time, I really didn't want to do it. But he had explained to me that I didn't need to worry because it was covered with this butter, I think, and garlic and spices. And then you had this special liquor right afterwards, so that would kill anything, and so you didn't need to worry. This was without risk. She says that there were no significant animal exposures. She does say they have a couple kids at home. She's an office worker, no medical surgical history in the past. And as noted, when I saw her on exam, she had enlarged lymph nodes in the back of the neck. Otherwise, the exam was pretty unremarkable. She was HIV negative, and there was a history of an associated fever.
Back of the neck. That's interesting.
The back of the neck.
It's a nuchal crest, or like Winterbottom sign.
Interesting that you say Winterbottom sign. We'll have to talk about that, won't we?
Can we ask some questions now before we go to the guesses?
Actually, it's been a month, so why don't you jump in? So you say Winterbottom sign.
Well,
what are you talking about there?
Well, that's African trypanosomiasis, but she wasn't exposed to that. I'm sure of that, but I just wanted to identify where the lymph nodes were swollen. So she was in Lebanon for 3 weeks. During that time, what was the exact timing of her ingestion of the raw meat dish?
So we don't have that. We have this rough. She remembers this sort of stood out in her memory, and that she'd been. But that's a good one because you're trying to sort of pin down an incubation.
Yeah.
Time.
I definitely am. What did I say?
I just played one of your videos. It was you saying rack of lamb.
No, but I think that's misleading, though, because this might not be that meat.
Dickson, can you take the first guess?
Sure. So these are guesses now. So Paul writes, Halzoon is the local name of a bucopharyngeal infection occurring in Lebanon, probably caused by Pentastomata larvae of Linguatula serrata. It's otherwise known as the dog tongue worm, which wander into the throat of the human host after ingestion of infected raw liver or lymph nodes from sheep or goats. Now, that's a quote from Wikipedia, the definition that they give there. There are other worms that could migrate out of raw meats, particularly from liver, which could also cause a Halzoon-like syndrome, and these would be the sheep liver flukes, which are very common throughout the Middle East. So you could actually end up with pharyngeal liver fluke infection, which we don't have any data as to what worm or what causative agent might be causing her problem. So, but Halzoon in this case that's the way he's defined it.
Daniel, remind us, did you tell us what kind of meat she ate?
No.
No, and we were actually putting that on our readers because she didn't know what meat it was. But I will jump in on this. So Halzoon was something that in the 6th edition we updated because prior editions had sort of suggested an association between Halzoon and Fasciola hepatica, and as we sort of updated that's been sort of put to rest. We don't think it's that, but there are other parasites, as mentioned here.
Right.
And actually, it's felt that Halzoon may be caused by a number of things, but it's actually still an area of investigation. We're trying to figure out exactly what is going on. So
thinking about other tests that you might have run, but I would have been too quick to run them based on this case history. Serologies, we're not going to ask about that until the end, right?
So I did send off serologies. Now, in this case, if you were worried about Halzoon, you could directly visualize or indirectly.
No, that's true.
Basically look into the pharynx.
This is actually.
And, yeah.
So that was from Paul Brindley, who has a lab at George Washington University.
That was a very good guess, by the way.
Daniel, can you take the next one?
Certainly. This is from Bjorn Borg. Wasn't that a famous tennis player?
And his brother yesterday. You know about his brother yesterday?
Bjorn yesterday?
Okay, so Bjorn writes, "Hi, doctors. I will be brief. If the meat was the source and we're only looking at parasites, then the clinical sign fits neither tapeworm, neither beef nor pork tapeworm, nor trichinosis. And using the when hearing hoofbeats, look for horses is heuristic. The obvious choice is Toxoplasma gondii, the world's most successful parasite. This parasite can infect essentially any mammalian cell. So it stands to reason that it can also infect epithelial cells in the throat too. And indeed, the PD6E, page 146, does list pharyngitis and lymphadenopathy as possible consequences of a T. gondii infection. I am sure a much longer list of differentials and ways to distinguish between them can be made, but I won't do that. I won't elaborate much on treatment except to say that if the lady is immune competent, is not pregnant, and does not plan to get pregnant in the immediate future, this infection will probably clear itself and no medication is indicated. If any of the above criteria are present, PD6E lists a variety of drugs, but there also seems to be a set of tricky trade-offs that needs to be done to determine the best treatment, or if lack of treatment is the best option. So I won't even try to elaborate. I guess I am now a longtime listener of TWiP, 4 years or so. It continues to be a joy to listen to you. You also serve as a healthy reminder that there is an interesting world out there with other things in it than telecommunications software, which is what I usually spend my days developing and thinking about. All the best, Bjorn.
Very nice.
Bjorn is from Norway, as you might guess. Yes. Was Bjorn Borg from Norway?
I don't think so.
No, where was he from?
I think he was from Sweden.
Yes, you're right. He's a Swedish former #1 tennis player.
Yeah.
All right. The next one is from...
But he ended up living in Monaco because they don't tax you there.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but you have to afford to live there. Right?
He could well afford to live there.
John writes, hello, doctors of TWiP. My guess for the case from TWiP 162, the woman who visited Lebanon and ate the raw meat dish, is toxoplasmosis, probably acquired by eating Chekhov's raw meat dish. What's Chekhov's raw meat dish?
No idea.
Okay. I based my guess on a video that I recently watched from the Parasitic Diseases playlist, starring a couple of likely lads, both of whom had eerily familiar voices. And I accidentally clicked it earlier, and that's why Dickson said, what did I say?
Got it.
Particular section of the video that stood out was excerpt from the transcript. What you ate for dinner might have been something that looked like this rack of lamb or a rare steak. That's the way we usually acquire the infection. So by ordering our meals rare or medium rare, in this case a rack of lamb, but of course a lot of us like our steaks not well done. You order a hamburger. Well, I don't have to quote the whole thing.
Please don't.
Those are the sage words.
You're making me eat my words.
Despommier from the toxoplasmosis video.
Right.
Symptoms of posterior cervical lymphadenopathy and sore throat are common with toxo, though Dr. Google surprised me when it showed me that the posterior cervical lymph nodes are actually in the neck. This was not where I was expecting them to be based on that name.
That's good.
Turns out that I don't know my posterior cervix from my elbow. He thought it was the posterior. Huh? If I had remembered Daniel's audio presentation, he mentioned lymph nodes in the neck, but Vincent's text notes mentioned posterior cervical lymph nodes. In Parasitic Diseases 6 edition, PDF has a different differential diagnosis table, table 11.2, page 146, to help distinguish between various other causes of lymphadenopathy. Dr. Griffin, not Griffiths, didn't mention any other symptoms, general malaise, low-grade fever. Most rare parasitic possibilities that also cause lymphadenopathy are Lyme disease and tularemia, but there is no mention of tick exposure and no mention of a rash or bite ulcers. An IgM test can determine if the toxo antibody is present since the patient had the potential exposure to toxo within the previous 3 weeks. I'll refrain from offering treatment options, as I have already demonstrated my medical weaknesses enough for one day, and who knows how I might suggest the medicine would be administered. Thanks for the great podcast, book, and lecture series, and season's greetings to you and yours, and all the best in the new year. Regards, John Mullen from Limerick, Ireland, where it is a crisp, clear 0 degrees C tonight.
Right.
Wonderful.
Right.
Dickson.
Yes, sir. Kendra writes, Dear TWiP professors, hello from Casper, Wyoming. It is sunny and 33 F or 1 degree C. My guess for TWiP case study 162 is toxoplasmosis gondii. A toxoplasmosis gondii infection is usually asymptomatic, however, and it can cause enlarged lymph nodes, particularly in the cervical nodes, and can cause a low-grade fever. It may be transmitted by eating raw meat, which contain pseudocysts. It is possible she became infected after eating the raw kebe. Serologic testing to measure IgG can determine toxoplasmosis infection. Treatment for toxoplasmosis is a combination of pyrimethamine and sulfadiazine. Best Kendra. And she lists a reference, remarkably similar to our textbook reference. In fact, it is our textbook reference.
Yes.
Daniel.
So Kendra actually mentions the name of this food, this kibe or kibe naye, or probably pronouncing it wrong because my Arabic is weak, but it's a mix of raw lamb and beef, and then it's ground up and it's mixed with a bunch of spices, bulgur, mint leaves, olive oil. Sometimes I'll put green onions in it. Yeah, I'm never going to try this. But anyway, so Adam writes, hi.
Freeze it first and you'll be fine.
My guess for the case in TWiP 162 is toxoplasmosis. It's the only relevant parasite I know of that causes low-grade fever and lymphadenopathy. Best regards, Adam Oscarsson. And he says he's there in Sweden, Halmstad, Sweden, right, where it's sunny. Okay.
Right. We've had right in from Scandinavia.
Brandon writes, Dear Doctors of Awesome, my second email submission, my first shortly after discovering TWiP 3 years ago. At that time, I had omitted Dr. Griffin from the email. This was not intentional, but only due to the fact that I'd only listened to the first 10 episodes for which Dr. Griffin was not part. Due to the nature of my schedule, which includes working full-time developing analytical assays in the animal health industry, part-time graduate student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and in the beginning stages of starting a company to develop novel treatments and diagnostics for people and animals that are envenomed by snakes, spiders, and scorpions, I always find that my attempts to answer the case studies are on the wrong side of time. Although I am in awe of the detailed responses many of the listeners provide, my guess is going to be straight to the point with not much of a differential. I believe the woman has toxo caused by toxogandhi, the combination of raw meat consumption, with fairly mild symptoms of someone who appears to be immunocompetent from the information provided, led me to immediately consider T. gondii. Majority of immunocompetent adults who acquire it are asymptomatic, but those that do show symptoms typically present within large lymph nodes in the cervical area and occasionally a low-grade fever. The fact that many are asymptomatic would explain why she exhibited symptoms while her husband did not and was probably exposed in the past, since he has consumed this raw meat meal throughout his life. Diagnosis can be confirmed through either PCR, looking at IgM response within 2 weeks, or IgG after 2 weeks. Due to mild symptoms, no treatment necessary. Not mentioned or asked if the patient was pregnant. If pregnant, then treatment would be necessary to prevent infection of the fetus. Treatment for someone pregnant with T. gondii is spiromycin, a macrolide antibiotic. Thank you for your contribution to science communication. I look forward to starting my own podcast about venomous animals by the end of the year, due in part by inspiration from listening to the Twix podcast. Cool.
That should be interesting.
I'll listen to that one.
Yeah, me too.
Tell us when you launch it, Brandon.
Exactly.
All right, Dickson, you get the big one.
I'm the winner. Okay. I'll do my best. Kevin writes, he begins by saying, a raw deal. Young woman ate raw meat in Lebanon 3 weeks ago. Presents with pharyngitis, posterior cervical adenopathy, and low-grade fever. Previously healthy. The case notes did not specify if the raw meat was wild or domesticated, nor did it speciate the flesh. Was it pork, beef, lamb, goat, horse, poultry, or reptile? See end notes. Case also states that a raw meal may have been washed down with some local liquor. Patient didn't become ill until approximately 3 weeks after consuming the suspected food. This case, alas, has opened numerous digestive bypass.
Digressive.
Digestive. I like digestive better. Digressive byways leading into theological territory, Islamic, Judaic, and Christian, animal husbandry, gastronomy, and the arcana of herbology. I will endeavor to spare the listener these tangential excesses and refer them to the end notes, which, if not a remedy for insomnia, will, as a Buddhist mantra, temporarily banish thought. If I could read this in a British accent, I think I would love to do that sometime, but I won't do that now. Most electronic medical records have a query field for a patient's religion. This information, with all due respect to the pieces of holistic medicine.
Pieties.
Oh, I'm sorry. Pieties of holistic. I think I should turn that's better. Is often irrelevant. An important exception might be knowing that a surgical patient is a Jehovah's Witness, since this faith prohibits blood transfusion. In our case, however, knowing whether our patient was a Christian or a devout Muslim could provide important clues to the diagnosis. More on this later. Gastronomy Part 1. Lebanese raw flesh dishes could be the following. 1. Keba naya. Keba naya is usually made of minced raw lamb or beef combined with bulgur, which is a wheat derivative, pureed onion, and spices. The word naya means raw or undercooked in Arabic. The Eliason outbreak report, see the reference, states that keba naya is a special kind of Lebanese salad prepared for celebrities.
Celebrations.
I think I'm becoming dyslexic. For celebrations such as Christmas and New Year's. In Eliason's paper, the kibbeh was prepared with pork, which would only be used in Christian villages. Some sources state that this dish is traditionally served with arka.
Arak.
A rack of lamb?
No, it's a liquor.
With arak. See more on this below. 2. You want to pronounce this one for me, Vincent?
Kubenyi.
Kubenyi, a local Lebanese specialty described in Chaim's 1997 paper. This guy writes beautifully and encyclopedic at the same time. This may just be a dialect or a transliteration of the more common term kebanaya. An internet food site simply translates kub naya as raw meat. Raw pork is known to be used for kubanyaya, as it was in Chaim's report. 3. Sauda naya, alternate spelling, sauda naya, or asbe naya, raw lamb liver with spices. Sawa naya is the best paired with the Lebanese homemade liquor arak, according to Wikibook's reference. These are traditional and likely possibilities. Our patient's exposure was certainly due to either pork, beef, lamb, or a mixture thereof. Other types of raw meat are more likely in an Asian location. Gastronomy, Part 2, the liquor. The overwhelming probability is that the local hooch consumed was arak, a distilled alcoholic beverage in the range of 40 to 50% alcohol, 80 to 100 proof, made from grape-derived alcohol and anise.
Aniseed.
Oh, aniseed. What is that? Is that from anise?
Anise, yeah.
Okay. That's a licorice flavor thing. Arak, Arabic for sweet juice. Arak has been known to associate with the textbook PD6, see endnote, a terminal curiosity. It is regarded as the national drink of Lebanon and is consumed widely in the Middle East. The taste is similar to the Greek ouzo, anisette, or pernod, i.e. an imitation absinthe. It is imbibed, diluted with very cold water in a ratio of 1 part arak and 2 parts of water. He sounds as though he may have some personal experience with this. The case notes suggest that our patient's host assured her that the alcoholic drink would neutralize any adverse consequences of eating raw flesh. See references for putative health or pharmacologic effects of anise seeds. Pimpinella anisum. That's the name of the plant that produces it. And the principal ingredient in its volatile oil, anethole, and anethole, anethole, right, is the conjunction of alcoholic beverages and parasitic diseases coincidental, or just a function of ubiquity of both? I submit for your consideration the confluence of alcohol and parasites that occur in TWiP 159, toddy and amoeba, and TWiP 156, babesia and scotch.
That's great.
This is this should be its own podcast. Theological considerations. U.S. Department of State Religious Demography of Lebanon 2016 lists 37% Christian, 57% Muslim, and the remainder being Druze, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, etc. Statistics may give a slight edge in predicting the likelihood of pork consumption in our patient. If the patient is a devout Muslim, it is highly unlikely that she consumed pork unless their butcher was unscrupulous. Islamic prohibitions of pork consumption parallel Judaic prescriptions as stated in Leviticus 11, chapters 11 and verse 7. The Quranic injunction, quotes, forbidden to you for food are dead meat, blood, dead meat? The flesh of swine, and that on which hath been invoked the name of other than Allah. Al-Qur'an, the Quran, in 5th paragraph, 3rd verse. On the other hand, if she were an Orthodox Muslim, presumably she would not partake of arak. If the patient is Christian, she is at risk for the illness that is described in Hyam's 1997 paper. Differential diagnosis, parasitological considerations, or the erection of the straw man. Viral, see reference, and bacterial foodborne illnesses always come to mind when raw meat comes up. These diseases are acknowledged only to be dispersed with. CDC.gov will provide a comprehensive list of culprits, parasitic diseases to consider here: protozoans, cestodes, nematodes. Toxocara, a theoretical possibility. See reference, which describes visceral larval migraines associated with ingestion of infected meat in Brazil. Unlikely here.
Ascaris, in the manner analogous to Toxocara, it's possible that ingestion of infectious larvae in undercooked or raw paratenic host meat could result in human infection. More than a long shot here. Taenia solium, a possibility whenever undercooked infected pork is ingested. I would not expect an acute presentation such as our patient exhibits, insufficient to account for our patient's presentation. Taenia saginata can be acquired by ingesting undercooked beef, generally asymptomatic, not a consideration. Echinococcus. This infection is acquired when humans eat the ova excreted by dogs. Definitive host. Contaminated leafy greens, vegetables is a typical route of infection. It is the dogs who eat the raw meat, often liver and other organs, and become parasitized by the adult. Not a consideration. Sarcocystis, acquired by eating undercooked or raw meat. Clinical manifestations, nausea, diarrhea, GI symptoms. Review from 2015 states no cases described from the Middle East, not relevant. Mesocystoides, rare. I don't mean undercooked, I mean rarely described. There's been a number of reports in Japan where many of the infections are related to the eating of raw snake meat. No implied judgment. Is there no raw flesh that is not consumed in Japan? Trichinellosis, sometimes called trichinosis, is well documented in Lebanon from consumption of wild boar and more commonly farmed hogs. Several outbreak reports from Lebanon are referenced below. I think it's unlikely our patient was exposed to raw hog meat. It's more likely from a demographic perspective that this patient was consuming halal meat, beef or lamb, which has almost no potential to transmit trichinella. Our patient does not exhibit the common clinical presentation for trichinella, which is fever, myalgia, and periorbital edema. The Olyson review states that 91% of cases reported periorbital edema. Clinical suspicion would be raised if patient had eosinophilia. Diagnosis would be PCR. Toxoplasmosis, ingestion of tissue cysts, bradyzoites, and undercooked or undercooked meal. 89% of acute infections in the immunocompetent host are asymptomatic. Presentation similar to an acute viral syndrome, mononucleosis-like illness, fever, malaise, myalgias, cervical adenopathy, pharyngitis. One cohort review states 88% of acutely infected patients had cervical adenopathy. These descriptions closely parallel our patients' clinical complaints, less common hepatosplenomegaly and ocular involvement. High seroprevalence in Lebanon compared to the U.S. And so I submit our patient is suffering from acute toxoplasmosis. Wishing all New Year greetings and untainted meat. And what follows are an amazing list of gastronomy references where you can see how much it costs for all these things, what you could eat, herbology references, wonderful, theological references, parasitology references, and at the very end, a terminal curiosity, Iraq in flagrante delicto with PD6. It is a photograph of PD6 with a bottle of golden Iraq which I assume that Kevin has consumed while reading PD6.
The bottle is not actually full. It's 3/4 full. So I presume that some of the liquor inside was consumed.
Daniel, you ever had a rack?
I have actually. Yes.
Okay.
It sounds like ouzo. It sounds delightful.
All right.
By the way, does it do the same thing, Daniel, when you pour it over ice? Does it cloud up?
So I didn't pour it over ice. I just had it straight out of a small glass.
Trying to prevent some parasitic infection, no doubt.
Yes, that's what I'm always trying to do.
Daniel, the next one is Carlo.
Carlo writes, "Hi, TWiP team. I'm writing on behalf of my inpatient medical team." This is the people in the hospital as opposed to people who can't wait. Exactly. Residents, interns, and medical students who work together on this case.
Exactly what I was thinking.
To summarize the case study of the patient with the woman who was born in Palestine, who moved to New York, that presented with a sore throat and posterior cervical lymphadenopathy of the neck, who had a recent trip to Lebanon where she ate some raw meat dish. The differential includes toxoplasmosis, cala-azar, acute filarial lymphadenitis, oncodermatitis, loa, Mancinella ozardi, as well as Mancinella streptocerca. The most likely diagnosis being toxoplasmosis. As her main complaint is the lymphadenopathy, and she had a recent exposure to a raw meat dish. Toxoplasmosis can be found almost anywhere in the world, so the travel history does not influence the differential as much here. Visceral leishmaniasis could be possible given her travel history, but it is often not associated with raw meat consumption. The epidemiology does not make sense for acute filarial lymphadenitis. Additionally, filariasis usually leads to inguinal lymphadenopathy. Oncodermatitis is more prevalent in Africa and would show enlarged inguinal or femoral lymph nodes. Loa can also lead to lymphadenopathy, but it is transmitted by a mosquito bite, more prevalent in Central and Western Africa. Mancinella ozardi is associated with exposure to South and Central America. Finally, Mancinella streptocerca would be more consistent with axillary or inguinal lymphadenopathy, and it is prevalent in Central Africa. Apart from parasitic infections, it would also be important to consider some viral infections like acute HIV, EBV, CMV, as well as other viral infections. Looking forward to the next episode, Carlo. And while I was reading that, Dickson either had some issues or had an epileptic fit, one or the other. Well, Dickson, are you okay?
I'm fine, but the essay is not.
you felt you felt like the differential included things that maybe shouldn't have been included. What was your?
There was a little mistake there, and I'm prone to overreact to these things anyway. But loa is not transmitted by mosquitoes; it's transmitted by the deer fly.
Yeah, and I tell people the way you can remember that, the different things, is so the loa is sort of like a thing you would say to your sweetie. So it's transmitted by the deer fly, whereas the loa. And river blindness is transmitted by the black fly, right? Think of the blackness.
Correct. And there's not a lot of flowing water in the Middle East. That's the problem with that diagnosis too. But it was good thinking. It was good thinking.
Carlo didn't, I said toxo is the most likely. Okay.
That's right.
All right, John writes, Trip Trio, greetings from Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska, where we are expecting significant snow this weekend. Once I heard that the woman visited Lebanon and ate raw meat, I immediately thought of Halzoon. Swollen lymph nodes and sore throat are consistent. The parasite responsible remains unknown, initially attributed to Fasciola hepatica, Linguatula serrata. There you go. Sixth edition of PD remains non-committal, but does cite Khalil et al. 2013, which found evidence for Dicrocelium dendriticum. Treatment involves removing the worm's saline nasal washings and anti-allergy medicines. Right. Dickson, Jacqueline.
I'll read that one now. Jacqueline writes, hello, TWiP hosts. Here's my guess for the case from episode 162 of the woman in her late 30s who recently visited Lebanon. Her recent dietary adventures immediately made me think of a toxoplasma gondii infection. Her nonspecific presentation of posterior cervical LADs, sore throat, fatigue, and headache would also align with this. According to PD6, the few patients who are symptomatic present with low-grade fever and enlarged cervical lymph nodes. The dish she likely tried was kebaneya, traditionally made with raw lamb or beef. Both are intermediate hosts for T. gondii that could have been harboring tissue cysts. Given that her husband had eaten that dish since childhood, he is likely already infected, explaining his lack of symptoms. Other things on the differential would include infectious mononucleosis or lymphoma, but the short course of her symptoms and the name of this podcast made me think that those are less likely. Serology could be done for confirmation with either IgM or IgG antibodies. It appears, per up to date, that IgG antibodies could be detected 2 weeks after infection. Assuming she's immunocompetent, only her HIV status was mentioned, no therapy is needed. If she's pregnant, she may need pyrimethamine and sulfadiazine to protect the fetus. I was introduced to your podcast by a classmate last year and decided to listen to every episode in order before throwing my hat into the ring for case studies. I finally caught up. I was hoping to be able to deliver a wider differential, but this case seems fairly toxo-esque to me. Dr. Jacqueline DeVries, and she's from the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine. She's a medical student in class of 2021.
Nice.
Nice is right.
Daniel.
Dear great doctors, Michaela writes, it has been about 2 years since I last emailed in. I stopped emailing because Dickson mispronounced my name. No, I added that.
I would not have mispronounced it.
In that time, I quit my job as a veterinary microbiologist in Ireland. I went traveling and teaching English in Korea.
Great idea.
I got back to Ireland a few months ago and have just landed myself a new job as a microbiologist in an orthopedic manufacturing company. And you guys have been part of my journey the whole time. Listening to the TWiP, TWIM, TWiV, Immune, Urban Agriculture, and all the rest have kept me in touch with my scientific side and even helped me land my new job. So thank you very much. For the case study, I would like to throw my hat in the ring. Although my parasitology is very rusty, my guess is Toxoplasma gondii. T. gondii is a worldwide parasite that wherever cats are, it will be. Infection is acquired by transferring the eggs to the mouth, by touching the eggs and touching your face, or also from eating contaminated, undercooked, in this case, raw meat. Usually, infection doesn't cause symptoms, but some people can get swollen lymph nodes, lymphadenopathy, fever, a vague ill feeling, and a sore throat, all symptoms that the woman mentioned. Less often, other organs can be affected in persons with weakened immune systems. Diagnosis is by blood testing for antibodies or a stool sample under a microscope. Treatment with pyrimethamine plus sulfadiazine and leucovorin. We're getting a little head shake there because maybe stool sample isn't the way to go here. Keep up the wonderful. I'll be listening every week, month as the episodes come out. Happy Christmas and have a wonderful New Year. I hope it snows this year as our whole country gets shut down so we can stay toasty in bed. So from Michaela in a cold, wet County Cork in Ireland.
How neat.
Hannah writes, Dear Twipanosomes, I'm a bit behind in my podcast, so I hope this gets you in time. I think the Palestinian woman has contracted T. gondii from eating raw meat. Speaking of interesting protozoan parasites, did you see this recent case report? Fatal Balamuthia mandrillaris brain infection associated with improper nasal lavage.
My goodness.
A Seattle woman died from a brain infection with Balamuthia a year after using a neti pot with tap water and developing an unusual rash on her nose. They don't have direct evidence that the neti pot was the source of her infection. However, it looks like this assumption is based on the timing and location of the rash thought to have been caused by the amoeba, as well as the fact that other brain-eating amoeba can be acquired that way. Wow.
Well, I was right.
A year.
Yeah.
Cheers, Hannah. P.S. I'm writing from beautiful Ottawa, Canada, where it's minus 13.5 C outside, wind chill minus 21, 21.5 in my office, 25 and 15 in our fly incubators, and 0 C in the ice water bath that I'm currently chilling live flies in.
Interesting.
Thank you for those temperatures.
We're not going to ask you what you're going to do with the flies either.
Dickson.
Yes. Till writes, Dear Professors TWiP, after venturing a guess for TWiP 160, I will try my second guess, this time sent from my private email address. I believe the woman with cervical lymphadenopathy and fever from TWiP 162 is suffering from acute toxoplasmosis. As you explained in previous episodes, toxoplasmosis is usually asymptomatic in the far majority of cases. However, it may occasionally cause fever and lymphadenopathy in adults upon first infection. And the throat symptoms might also be a result of the acute infection. The mode of transmission, eating undercooked raw meat, would also fit the diagnosis. The prevalence of toxoplasmosis in Lebanon seems to be quite high, nearly 80% of Lebanese pregnant women being IgG positive. Differentials include other parasitic infections like African trypanosomiasis can be dismissed since it is not endemic in Palestine, Lebanon, or malaria. Non-parasitic infections like systemic viral, CMV, EBV, or local bacterial pharyngitis infections. Of non-infectious diseases, we have to consider malignant diseases, lymphoma, and autoimmune diseases, systemic lupus erythematosus, and sarcoidosis. Diagnosis could be obtained by differential serological methods, employing either indirect fluorescent antibody or ELISA tests, or by PCR from the serum. Unless she has an underlying malignancy or immunocompromising disease other than HIV, we could expect a benign development and expect the patient's symptoms to recede without lasting consequences. However, the lymphadenopathy usually takes several weeks and sometimes months to digress. Treatment is often only recommended for people with severe disease or an underlying condition that would let one expect the development of complications. If we would treat, the drugs of choice would include pyrimethamine, sulfadiazine, and clindamycin. Trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole, which is the drug of choice for prevention, is not used for treatment. Once again, thank you for your super cool broadcast. Keep them coming. Cheers, Till. Till we meet again.
All right, good.
Madiha writes, Dear TWiP professors, this is my first time writing into your program. I've been a listener of TWIM and TWiV off and on for 1 year and recently started listening to TWiP. I am grateful to my colleagues from work who mentioned the trio of podcasts during small talk when I started fellowship training in infectious diseases at the University of Maryland Medical Center last year. I think you all bring so much awe and visceral joy to a listener like myself by sharing some papers that I would never come across on my own with my busy schedule. In TWIM, I love the discussions of Dr. Swanson and Dr. Schechter. That's partly responsible for my late intro to TWiP. However, now that I've started listening to TWiP, this is all I want to hear on my drive to and from work. I've enjoyed these so much that I wanted to hazard a guess at this week's case study. I am happy for the length of time that was available for the answer, as I was able to go back to the beginning of TWiP and listen to the episodes I thought were relevant based on the answers I thought for this case. Hope I'm not too late. I am thoroughly enjoying the historical back and forth between Dr. Racaniello and Dr. Despommier. I must confess that I feel a little bit like I did when, as a teenager, I was on page 200 of Gone with the Wind and so happy that there were another 800 to go. I'm very happy that I have a treasure trove to explore and hopefully share with my daughter grows up so she can develop a love for science. I also browsed through the PDF copy of Parasitic Diseases, focusing on the section relevant to the current case study. I love hard copies of books, and I know I could buy it for myself, but would really love a signed copy if I'm lucky enough to win one. Until then, we'll make do with the PDF, which you so kindly made available for free. So, for our Palestinian-born, now American patient who ate a raw meat dish in Lebanon and returned to develop low-grade fever, sore throat, which subsequently improved, and posterior cervical adenopathy in less than a week. Our patient is HIV negative. Interesting. The husband is unaffected, but he's eaten that dish for his whole life. My immediate thought was salmonella, non-typhi, given the raw meat meal. Salmonella live in the intestines of most food animals, and contamination can occur during slaughter and processing. The headache went with that diagnosis, but then it starts to fall apart. Most important is the absence of GI symptoms or severe systemic illness. Swollen cervical lymph nodes are not typically seen in salmonella, gastroenteritis, or enteric fever. Patients have high-grade fevers, although they do have abdominal mesenteric lymph node swelling, leading to abdominal pain and diarrheal illness, sometimes even perforation and ileus. Other possible but unlikely differentials include EBV mono, acute CMV, the patient is missing the organomegaly, liver and spleen, serology for IgM to both would help differentiate. Lastly, the other diagnosis that initially popped in my head is going to be my final answer. My thoughts were further consolidated after a review of TWiPs 12 and 13, as well as parasitic diseases, pages 141 to 154. The patient most likely ate a dish of raw lamb, sheep, or beef meat, which Dr. Googles calls Kibe-nea, which is very likely to harbor the culprit pathogen. Dr. Despommier's detailed story, pardon me if I can't recall it accurately, of the 4 medical students who ate incompletely cooked meat burgers at this one restaurant in New York and then developed cervical lymphadenopathy, malaise, and sore throat, I think was very fascinating and helpful. Our patient had acute toxoplasmosis in an incompetent host. Cervical lymphadenopathy and sore throat that resolves are seen in this illness. Diagnosis can be made by testing for toxoplasma serology. I do not know how useful PCR testing would be in this case, but I would be extremely curious from a scientist viewpoint to check it and see if she has detectable toxo-PCR in blood. I expect that she would not, as the toxo should have already invaded the tissues and disappeared from the blood, given that she is immunocompetent. We could biopsy her swollen lymph nodes and may see tachyzoites, or will they already have become bradyzoites in tissues or smears obtained from biopsy? However, given that toxo in immunocompetent patients is self-limited, I would not subject our poor patient to any unnecessary procedures. No treatment is necessary as the disease is self-limiting in all immunocompetent hosts. Thank you again. Looking forward to your next podcast. Madi.
Very nice. All right, our last one, if you have made it this far. Dana writes, hello, TWiP professors. We are a group of first-year medical students who are part of a global health educational track. Our assigned task was to listen to your podcast and submit a guess.
Oh, nice.
Fortuitously, our medical school is located in Lebanon, Oregon. So it was meant to be that we were given this particular assignment. We believe the most likely diagnosis is Toxoplasma gondii, commonly transmitted from lamb, beef, and pork. Patient likely contracted this when she consumed raw kibbeh, a customarily Lebanese dish consisting of minced raw lamb or beef mixed with bulgur spices, garlic, mint leaves, olive oil, and green onions. Getting hungry. Most common symptoms in an otherwise healthy patient, like the one in this case, are described as flu-like, including swollen lymph nodes, muscle aches, fatigue over weeks to months, can also be asymptomatic. Differential would include Haemonchus contortus, which is the most significant parasite of sheep and goats throughout the U.S. and the world. Her symptoms are consistent with the symptoms related to such an infection, which include a general unwell feeling. Another differential would be rhinovirus. While this could be unlikely, mainly due to the fact that this is a podcast about parasites, it is a common illness that could easily have produced the patient's symptoms. Cold symptoms manifesting in close proximity to our trip could simply be a coincidence. This diagnosis is supported by a decrease in the pharyngeal inflammation in subsequent exams. However, healthy individuals usually recover within 7 to 10 days. Sincerely, Dana, Stephen, Alex, Vicky, Irene, and Chris.
Nice.
Awesome. Really cool.
Very nice.
Wow. See, the longer we have between episodes, the more guesses you get.
This is all true. Well, we still only have one book to give away.
Daniel, why didn't the husband get sick? Oh. Well, we're not going to know that.
Well, we're going to get to that soon, but I was trying to remember the story you must have told about, they went to a restaurant to have the cooked burger or something Dickson?
They were, this is a classic. In the early days of heart transplantation, Christian Barnard was speaking at Cornell, and these 4 students were out of class late, had to get something. They were hungry. So they went to the local hamburger joint, as they called it, but it's the nickname that they gave it was the Recovery Room. That was the name of the restaurant. And they asked them to make hamburgers, but quick. We had to get to a lecture really quick. So they did it. They flipped them, but the meat was probably raw on the inside, not even defrosted yet, perhaps, if it was frozen. And all 4 of them went to the lecture. They heard Christian Barnard talk. And then several weeks later, they started to one by one report to the student health clinic, thinking, of course, the worst. They thought that they had Hodgkin's disease. They thought they had lymphomas. They thought they had all these things. But this was in the early days, by the way, when they were first starting to work out the serology for toxoplasmosis. Ann Kimball was the technician in charge of serologies for parasites at that time. And I was a good friend of hers because I was also a technician here for a while. So we had a lot in common. And she told me this story. And of course, each one of them was relieved beyond belief when they found out that they had toxoplasmosis and not some untreatable cancer. So that's the end of the story. I mean, it's a simple story, but it's one which I think every medical student goes through when they hear about a disease. They go home and they say, "Oh my God, I probably have that. I've had those symptoms." I don't know. How did you feel, Daniel, when you were in medical school? I actually gave you a lecture once. Did I make you sick when you went home afterwards?
Yeah, but it wasn't. Yeah.
Oh no! Wait a minute. Now we're getting too personal.
There's a name for that, right?
It's Yes, it's the hypochondriac's dream.
There's a real name. I'll look it up.
But yeah, and there was a similar where there was a lecture and there was everybody was waiting for the burgers to cook, and the lecturer was apparently impatient. Was like, "Just serve the burgers. I'm going to start talking now." And then the burger, and again, medical education scenarios.
Sure,
it's really
sure.
So you can't rush your meat, maybe.
Don't. But, vegans would have been okay at that point.
So it's called medical students' disease or nosophobia.
Oh, nosophobia. Isn't that interesting?
All right.
So I guess before we do the unveil, Vincent, shall we give you and Dickson an opportunity?
Yeah, sure. Well, I have to say, I went with Toxo also because you can get it from what she ate. The symptoms are similar, and could explain why the husband doesn't have any symptoms. So that's what I know.
But it doesn't rule out Halzun because we don't know what the meat was.
No.
And we have to depend upon our physical examination physician who is in control of this whole conversation by withholding the answers.
What did you think? Did you think of Toxo?
Well, I thought it was Toxo until I rethought this. Daniel and I had a conversation yesterday about something else, and then I just had gotten back from vacation, and he asked, "Well, what did you think of the patient's disease?" And I said, "Well, I'll reserve my answer for tomorrow." But I hesitated because I hadn't read it in a while, and I had forgotten basically. But when I saw that first diagnosis of Halzun, I thought it's possible because there's no way to differentiate those two diseases unless you do a thorough physical examination to try to find the worms that are in the nasal pharynx. So, and you do the proper serologies, of course. So now we throw ourselves at your mercy because we're out of guesses based on conjecture. We need some more facts.
So what did you do next, Daniel?
Yeah.
So and it was in our thing, and it would have been unfair for me to not, to say like, oh, and I did a limited exam, and I'm not telling you what I saw. No, so I did do a thorough exam, and there was nothing present in the oropharynx.
Okay.
Just a mild bit of erythema, and there was no nasal involvement. That's sort of an interesting thing described with Halzun is that people often are complaining of a rhinitis, of a runny nose, and nasal congestion. So this was just sore throat, prominent lymph nodes in the back of the neck,
right?
And so, and I sort of liked what this, I thought this probably was. And people actually, I thought it was nice. They referenced our table in 146.
That's right.
Because we see a lot of times where patients come in with low-grade fever, feeling a little crummy, and significant lymph node swelling in the neck.
Right.
And yes, people do run through that. Oh my gosh, is this lymphoma? Exactly. And we often make the distinction by the fact that the presentation is pretty acute, that people then get better, which is sort of nice. But no, that's always in a differential. The fact that it was posterior versus anterior, the fact that it was fairly prominent posterior adenopathy. And we put in our table some of the big things that we see is that you can very quickly with blood testing help sort these out.
That's right.
So the initial concern, I think, by her primary doc was that this might be a mono diagnosis. And we actually refer to this clustering of presentations as mono-like illnesses. So the EBV serology actually showed this woman is still IgM negative, IgG negative for EBV. So she does not have EBV. Serology was done for CMV, also negative for CMV. But what was really nice was the initial serology showed an IgM positivity for toxo, an IgG negativity.
Right.
And then, let's clinch it, 3 weeks later, we did repeat serology. Now the IgG was off the charts, over 1,000.
Did you look for a heterophile test also?
So I actually did the specific EBV serology as opposed to heterophile is an interesting test. We were actually getting a cross-reactivity with heterophile, so like horse cells, red cells.
Sure.
So that had actually been done by the primary doc and was negative.
Right.
That's sort of our monospot test.
Yep, that's it. Cool.
Yeah, so this was like a really solid sort of and Dickson asked a little bit, what was the timing? Now, the incubation from exposure to sickness with toxo could range as short as 5 days or to even a little bit over 3 weeks. So that's why I was vague about she'd been there for the last 3 weeks before. So that sort of gave us a little bit. But you never know. Like when, I was fishing when, she presented, I was like, oh, this is pretty compelling for toxo. And that's why I started my questioning with are you a vegetarian? And then that prompted out came this whole,
That's right.
My darn husband, and it's all his fault.
Yeah, so Vincent has a question.
So what was the meat? Do we know based on her religious preference? Can we say?
So we could almost put it together. She's having the liquor afterwards, so we know she's not an observant Muslim.
Okay.
And so it was a lamb beef mixture.
Right.
And then there was the alcohol afterwards.
Interestingly enough, if you freeze that preparation until it's solid all the way through and then defrost it, it's safe.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting
but they don't like that because it ruins the texture.
I mean, the interesting thing too is it a big deal, right? We've talked about that in Lebanon. 80% of people, like women, by the time they become pregnant, have already been infected.
Yeah.
80% of the French population, 80% of folks in Brazil, huge portions of the world are infected with toxo. What you want to do is get infected with toxo before you're pregnant, because the real thing we run into is that you get toxoplasmosis infection while pregnant, and that there's this issue with congenital transmission to the child. Yeah. Or the other side of the puzzle is people who are immuno-incompetent. And one of the big presentations we had seen more, and we still see a fair amount, is in the HIV population. The immune destruction from HIV leads to a point where the toxo does not stay dormant, and they can actually end up with a reactivation toxo issue.
Yeah.
And why is the husband well?
I have to assume that if he's lived his whole life eating this stuff, that he's already infected. So
did you
get reinfected?
Now, was there any concern about pregnancy here?
So she was not pregnant, and that was important to determine.
Now, if she said she intended to become pregnant, what would you do?
So we actually recommend that they wait, sort of get outside this acute period. There's a whole timing, and we actually go into this in our textbook a little, but we know about the risk to the child, to the fetus, if you get infected during the first trimester, second versus third.
Yeah.
And so the severity of infection, consequences change on the timing. And then the recommendations on what it's safe to use during pregnancy also are different than when you're not pregnant.
Yep.
And this is also, I think everyone might remember, this is where the drug suddenly, the price was raised like 1,000-fold, some absurd increase.
Sure, that's right.
And so there were actually access problems in getting the medicines for treatment.
The thing that caused me to think twice about toxo, though, was because she's 30 years old. She's from Lebanon. It's 80% positivity by the age of, let's say, 20. So her chances of being positive for toxo were good without knowing what the serology was. And so therefore you had to look for an alternative to toxo. And so Halzun was the only other one I could come up with.
And I think,
but once the serology is back, then it's obviously not bad.
And I think that's good. And Halzun, probably a lot of docs wouldn't think about. So I think it's good to have that, because if you don't think about something, it's going to be hard to make the diagnosis. So it sort of prompts you to make sure you do a really careful exam. And also I tried to point out, she originally was from Palestine, and that this was sort of stood out in her mind because she'd never eaten this before.
Right.
So, here she suddenly.
So that's right. We don't have any statistics about Palestine with regards to positivity for toxo. This was a statistic that came out of Lebanon, not out of Palestine.
Yes,
so
exactly.
But I was assuming that it's similar, but perhaps not.
Yeah.
Daniel, did you on purpose tell us about the drink so that we would, calculate the
right.
the likelihood of her eating pork or
meat? I have to. This is one of the great things about infectious disease, right? Is it when I'm seeing the patient, I transport myself mentally to this wonderful Arab part of the world, and they're eating this dish, and the
music is playing, they're dancing. Come on, how do you say no? It's true.
I also think it's very cool that these group of medical students got this as an assignment.
That was great.
Solve it and send it in. Good idea.
And they got it right. Now, I have a question.
Most people got it right.
I have a question for you. What if they're lucky enough to win the book? Do we send one to every one of those people?
One book. They'll have to cut it up into bits.
They'll have to share it. They'll have to remain lifelong friends.
We will talk about that. We will talk about
They can donate it to the local library. Speaking of book, let's give it away. We had 15 guesses.
That's marvelous.
So I'm going to pick a random number between 1 and 15.
Here comes the drum roll.
Are you ready? Number 13. 15. 14 was 13 is till.
Till we meet again.
Till we meet again.
We are. That's right.
All right. Till, send me your address to TWiP at microbe.tv. If you're in the U.S., that's all I need, your address. If you're outside of the U.S., I need a phone because shipping requires that, not because I'm going to call you and ask you questions. Just for shipping. Till is the winner. Very good.
Cool.
And all you others, just keep trying. We have lots of these books.
We have a lot of books.
And Dickson and Daniel will sign them. And eventually, if you keep trying.
That's right. You never know.
Because you can't win twice, so.
That's right. You never know. You never know.
Good job. All right, we have a paper which I picked just for Dickson.
You did that.
In honor of Dickson.
You did that. I was so touched.
And it's actually a good paper.
It's excellent.
It's published in PLOS Pathogens. It's called Mucosal Immunoglobulins Protect the Olfactory Organ of Teleost Fish Against Parasitic Infection. And this comes from the College of Fisheries I love it, the College of Fisheries at Huazhong Agricultural University in Wuhan, the University of New Mexico, and the Qingdao Laboratory for Marine Science. Qingdao.
As in beer.
And I picked it because the fish here is a trout.
Yes.
And Dickson loves to catch and release trout.
I do.
Do you, Daniel? You don't fish, Daniel, right?
He did.
I actually am quite a fisherman. I've been fishing with Dickson. I used to, in Colorado, I lived where you could walk out my back door and fly fish. And I used to keep my series of rods sort of racked. My one with the hopper, my one with the attractor, my one with the mayfly. And my son caught his first fish on a fly rod at age 2.
Nice.
Dickson, what's a teleost?
A bony fish.
A bony fish.
That's right.
And what's the ones before without bones?
Those are chondrichthyes.
Like sharks?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is all about the nose of fish.
The nose of fish, which, by the way, for them is like 80% of their sensory input. Well,
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. They have great eyesight, first of all. They have remarkable eyesight, but they also have an incredibly acute sense of smell.
Dickson. They have eyes on either side. How do they synthesize what's in front of them?
They have a window. They have a window. And that's a very good question. As a fly fisherman, we were always posed to answer those kinds of questions. And so we have books that will actually show you what the trout sees as the fly approaches.
Is there a gap in front?
There's a window in front. It's like tunnel vision.
Yeah.
Right?
Interesting.
So that's why they don't go much out of their feeding lanes. They have a feeding lane. They stay put, and the food actually comes to them. But the rainbow trout is a very interesting fish. It's part of an Oncorhynchus series. Mm-hmm. The Oncorhynchus series includes the salmons. So they're anadromous. They're called anadromous fish. They spawn in fresh water, but they live in salt water.
Right.
The rainbow trout will do that. Given the opportunity, the rainbow trout will actually go into the ocean. Now, the question is, how do they find their way back home? Because they go back to the same river that they were born in.
Mm-hmm.
So how do they do that?
I don't know. Smell?
Yes. It's not eyesight, and it's not sensory like vibrations. It's smell. And they are incredibly selected for life as a fish that can smell their way back home. So you can think of all the things that can interfere with smell in a river: pollution, storms, particulates of various sorts, all kinds of horrible things that go in that distract the fish from their appointed rounds, so to speak, and keep them from going back into the rivers of their origin. And they actually learned this by transporting salmon from the west coast of the United States to the Great Lakes. Mm-hmm. And there they did some very interesting experiments of imprinting with various chemicals to say, this is the river of your origin. So they put some butyric acid in there, which smells to us just like butter. And they imprinted the fish with that. And then 3 years later, they dripped the butyric acid into the river where they came from. And the adult salmon found their way right back into that river. Then they imprinted the same group of fish, not the same fish, of course, but the same species, with butyric acid. And they went out into the Great Lakes to forage on alewives. And 3 years later, they moved the scent from the river that they were born in to another completely different river, and they dropped the butyric acid in that river, and they came back to that river instead of their home river, proving to the scientists that for sure they're using smell as their homing device.
It's a nice experiment.
It was a fabulous experiment, and it worked out perfect. So if you're a fish that depends on smell to tell you whether the food is present, to tell you whether your mate is present, to tell you whether you're in the right place, can you imagine the selective pressure in evolution to include an immune response against anything that would interfere with that in the way of an infectious disease? And that's why this is a great paper.
Well, and also because we're drawing lots of things in. We inhale air right through our nose and we pull pathogens in. And fish are flowing lots of water.
That's right. And it's
in their mouth.
It's an open system.
Hey, do they have nose?
They do. They have nares.
Nares, right?
Of course they do. Of course.
And then there's a system that goes
and
back.
it's contiguous with their pharyngeal cavity.
And the gills as well?
No, the gills
that's
are
separate.
Down further.
It's downstream.
But they have a stream of water that's constantly going into their nose.
So they need the sense, as you just said, but that also introduces viruses and bacteria and parasites.
All kinds of stuff.
So the point is these nasal mucosa has to be protected, has to have an immune system.
Absolutely.
And that's the nasopharynx-associated lymphoid tissue, or NALT.
NALT. I love it.
We have MALT and GALT. That's right. What else? Gut associated and mucosal associated. Now we have nasopharynx associated, which has been well studied in mammals, but less so in fish, teleosts especially. So that's what this paper is about. And they are the most ancient bony vertebrates with a NALT.
That's interesting, isn't it?
They make immunoglobulins of 3 classes: IgM,
right,
which we just heard.
Yep.
IgD.
Right.
And either IgT or IgZ. Now, I love this. IgT from trout.
Yes.
And IgZ from zebrafish.
That's right.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, it is, actually.
IgT. And they've also found secreted IgD like our secreted IgA.
And we make IgD also.
We do.
But it's a primitive response, right? It leads to the IgA or IgE or IgA.
That's right. And so they want to know what's going on here. And they have a system where they purchase trout.
Right.
And they put them in tanks.
Right.
And they infect them.
So I have another question for you before we go any further.
Yeah.
Why do you think they're so concerned about this in China?
Oh, it's a big industry, fish, right?
They're raising fresh. This isn't true for saltwater fish, right?
They're raising freshwater
fish. And what is the biggest problem with that, do you think?
Pollution.
Yeah, and the increase in infectious diseases associated with crowding. And they're raising cyprinoid fish mostly, which are carp fish, grass carp and that sort of thing. But we have a lot of discussion about that in our textbook because a lot of parasitic infections are transmitted by eating raw fish.
So you call the carp cyprinoids.
Yes.
So what do you call the trouts? Teleos?
No, they're salmonids. They're salmonids.
Salmonids. Okay. Yeah. Teleos are the whole bony fish.
Correct. Right? And their studies don't apply to saltwater fish.
So an eel would be a teleost, but that's a saltwater fish.
No.
They're freshwater eels?
Well, there are two kinds.
Yeah, okay. I need a lesson in fish.
They're conadromous. They're conadromous. They're not anadromous, as the salmon are and the trouts. The eels live in freshwater as adults, and they swim out into the ocean to actually spawn in the Sargasso Sea, which is off the coast of Florida.
When my kids were young, I read a book to them about eels that do that.
Yeah.
Ozzy the eel or something.
You know what?
Like that.
They do this from Europe and from the United States, and they all mix up in the Sargasso Sea.
Yeah.
But they don't mate. They don't cross mate. They mate with themselves, and then they go all back again.
Hey, Dan, you get the idea this guy knows his fish?
He does know his fish.
Well, he's passionate about it.
Dickson, they use this ciliated parasite called Ichthyotherius multifilus.
Correct.
Have you encountered this before?
It is the scourge of aquarium dealers and aquarium owners. It is the scourge because it's so easy to transmit it from aquarium to aquarium.
What is this, an amoeba?
No, and it's a ciliated protozoan. It's related to Ballontidium coli. Mm-hmm. Right, in a distant form. I think it's a hypotrich, if I'm not mistaken, but I could be wrong about that. There are different kinds of ciliated protozoans, okay? And in this case, the ones that have even cilia along their bodies, like paramecium, for instance, which you learned about in high school biology, that's one kind. But there are some holotrich ciliates that live in the gut tract of termites and cattle and help them process cellulose. And this one is a little bit like the myxobolus parasite that causes whirling disease in trout. This is a little. We covered that.
Also once. A protozoan, right?
Also a protozoan.
Yeah, we did cover it. Someone asked us to.
Yes, myxobolus cerebralis is
whirling disease.
Exactly.
So, what does Ichthyotherius do to fish?
It looks kind of innocuous when you look at it to begin with because it makes these little white lesions underneath the scales of the fish, but it also infects their gills. Mm-hmm. It infects their nares. It infects their pharyngeal cavity. And eventually, if you don't treat it, it's 100% lethal.
How would you treat it?
They have lots of things, copper sulfate solutions, antibiotics in the water, all kinds of stuff. Very difficult to get rid of. Very difficult.
All right. So that's why they're interested in this.
They are, because you could lose an entire farm's worth of cyprinoid fish that has huge economic value for those people. And they're probably in the process of losing them now. So what do you do when you lose an entire farm's worth of fish? You drain the ponds, you dry them, you sterilize it by drying them out, and then you start all over again. That's probably a year's process. So, it's got huge economic repercussions.
Yep. All right.
So the point of this paper, however, is that ick, as it's called.
Ick?
It's not.
Oh, ick. I remember that.
That's
ick.
right. That's right.
When I had fish, they used to say you have ick.
That's the deal. And that's this parasite.
That's it. I didn't know it was
That is this parasite.
Ick.
So the point is that they're not looking at the true relationships of the cyprinoid fish with their parasites. They're studying the immune system of fish, period.
There's a model system.
That's correct.
So trout don't usually get ick?
No, that's not true.
They do get ick.
Yeah, but they live in cold water, you see. Cyprinoid fish live in warm water. Mm-hmm. So their chances of getting this are much, much better than trout.
We used to drip something in the water when our fish had it.
Yeah, exactly. Gentian violet is one
probably,
thing. Or methylene blue or something.
Yeah, methylene blue. Yeah, right.
Something that will interfere with their the respiration.
Got it.
So, but it's hard to find another organism that's as pathogenic as this one.
In fish.
In anything.
Well, Ebola is pretty pathogenic.
Yeah, but you could talk about rabies, for instance. It's, 95%
rabies,
lethal?
Unvaccinated, 100%.
100. Well, here's another one.
Yeah.
Here's another one.
All right.
Very few.
So is this the rabies of trout?
Yeah. Something like that.
Just kidding. So they do a number of interesting studies to characterize immune responses in the nose, nasopharynx.
Yes.
Starting with what's there.
Right.
And they collect mucus from fish.
Yes. Well, that's their only protective coating.
Fish have mucus, just like us.
Of course they do. Yeah, but they use it in a different way.
What's that?
They protect the outside of their bodies.
They also have it inside, though, right?
They do, but the mucus layer on the outside is very, very, it's vital for these fish.
Yeah, when you pick up a fish, of course.
Slimy, right?
Slimy, and you always say, don't hold it too long.
Put your hand in the water first and then lift up
Why
the
is
fish.
that?
Because you don't rub off as much mucus that way.
When we were fishing that last summer, or the summer before, you were very careful
Absolutely.
when you picked up the fish.
You always dip your hand in the water first. It's better to not touch them at all. So a lot of us fish with flies that don't have any barbs.
Mm-hmm.
So they're easy to get out of the mouth of the fish without touching the
right
fish
in the
itself.
net, right?
Yep. Or you can use forceps.
Yeah.
Just get them out.
Fascinating.
Hemostats.
So they take this mucus, they put it over a column, and they run the extracts on the gel. They could see the size of these things. They could see IgT and IgM and IgD, et cetera, see their sizes and blah, blah, blah. It's cool. They can find a polymeric Ig receptor in the olfactory organ.
Right.
So we know that in mammals, secretory IgA is produced below the epithelium, and it can be transported through by binding to a protein called polymeric Ig receptor, PIGR, and they show that the same thing is present here. It's in the olfactory organ of the trout. I guess they have to take apart these animals to do this. Right?
Unfortunately, it's true. Yep.
You think they eat them afterwards?
These are tiny little rainbow fingerlings. They're not very big fish.
I say they're like 30 grams.
30 grams is pretty big.
Yeah. It said in the methods section, like 10 inches long.
Yeah, something like that.
For you, of course, that would be nothing.
Exactly.
They have a bath infection model, they say.
Yes.
So what is that? They put them in water and they add the parasite to the water?
That's correct.
So the parasite will find the fish and get into the...
Eventually, because the fish actually filters the water through its nose.
Of course, it's going to pull it right in. It says here, it directly invades the mucosal tissues.
That's right.
Including skin, gill, and fin.
Correct.
All right. So it's never been reported to infect the olfactory organ. So after 7 days after infection, they see dots on the skin and the fins.
So wait a minute, you said something very important there.
Mm-hmm.
It's never before been reported to infect the nasal cavity.
Mm-hmm.
That's very important. It's everywhere else on the fish. Why isn't it there?
Maybe they have a good immune response.
Aha!
They make some H&E stained sections. They could see the parasites, and it's in the nasal cavity and the mucosa.
Mm-hmm.
They find it there by sectioning by PCR, etc. 7 days after infection, and peaks at 7 days. But they have a second wave at 21 days, drops at 28 days, goes up again 75 days post-infection.
This parasite has a weird life cycle.
They say it's a chronic infection.
Yeah.
If it doesn't kill you, it stays with you a long time.
That's right.
They also look at, by PCR, they look at the expression of immune genes. And they see some go up, pro-inflammatory and complement-related genes go up, cycling with the parasites, as we've mentioned here. They can see IgT and IgM going up as well. So it seems to be in response to the parasite infection.
Right.
So that's pretty cool.
Yes.
And they have other control organs, which include kidney, I think, and something else where they're not infected and they don't see increases in the immune genes, which is cool.
Mm-hmm.
So they say these results show that it can chronically infect the trout olfactory organ and induce long-lasting IgT responses. IG trout.
Yep.
Next time you're at a restaurant, order some IG trout. See what they say.
Right.
What else?
I know what they're going to say, by the way.
What are they going to say?
They say, what?
So in the olfactory cavity, they can find the parasites coated with IgT. Isn't that cool? They're actually coated with them. So I don't know how they would neutralize them or kill them. Maybe it
might immobilize them.
It could, yeah.
Because that's what happens in a lot of gut-associated infections.
They also see IgT positive B cells coming into the nasal epithelium after infection. You know, so they think that they're actually they want to know if they come in or if they proliferate there. They did an experiment to look at that. What was the result?
It's there.
Well, the IgT B cells go up, and then they secrete the antibodies. So the antibodies are not recruited from elsewhere. Okay.
So these are like plasma cells.
They're like plasma cells. They're IgT positive B cells, and they're responsible for making the IgT in the olfactory epithelium. Mm-hmm. And these B cells proliferate in the olfactory organ after they add parasites, right? So you get proliferation of these IgT positive B cells and also IgM positive. So I guess IgM is made first and then you shift to IgT, and those can help clear the infection.
So I had a question as I read through this paper too, and that is, there should be some aquarium specific test for the acute ability of a fish to sense smell. All right. And there should be some behavioral induction test that you could run to see whether or not these parasites are actually interfering with that or not, and whether the immune system is helping against that.
It's a good idea. Would you assume that they were doing something?
Well,
because the whirling disease, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well, now that they know that there's a robust immune response coming from the nasal passage, it would now be the next step is to prove that it's doing something rather than just trapping a few parasites.
Yeah. Well, they say here they think the olfactory route may be one of the main targets of this parasite. So that's the main finding here, that they show that it can infect the olfactory organ when you expose them by this bath route. And they say, by the way, Dickson, that protozoans are the most common parasites of fish.
I would believe that.
Yeah, we would. When you catch trout, do you ever see spots on them?
No. But if you had asked me about bass fishing, I could tell you about another parasite, because the freshwater clams produce a larval stage which embeds itself underneath the skin of bass, freshwater fish like perch and sunfish and bass. And when you keep some of the bass to eat, like smallmouth bass, which we used to do up in the New York State lake systems, and you fillet the fish, you can find these larvae scattered throughout the flesh of the fish. And for a long time, we were hesitant to eat them because we didn't know what we were looking at. But these larvae then mature, and then they actually fall out of the fish. They burrow their way out, and they complete their life cycle. So I was fascinated to learn that clams have a parasitic life cycle stage in freshwater fish.
Interesting. Another interesting point. So they think that the IgT actually help to clear the parasite, but in some fish it remains and it can persist for a long time. So
I think it depends on whether the fish uses its sense of smell as part of its biology or not. And I'm not convinced that their cyprinoid fish would be as sensitive to changes in environment than trout, because trout almost require a pristine environment. I remember how impressed you were when we floated down the north branch of the Bitterroot River as to how pretty it was and how clear.
Very nice.
And how unpolluted the water looked.
Gorgeous.
That's a trout habitat. If you go to a carp habitat, which is a lake, or sometimes, well, I won't say all the time because I'm going to get some letters in this one. Some carp live in that kind of a situation.
Yeah,
but
they don't carp about it, right?
They don't. they don't carp pool either.
Or carpe diem, right?
They carpe diem. They do that a lot. They might slip you a fin every now and then.
This is a terrible series of puns.
You're gonna cut this whole part out. But so I'm not sure as to what part of the fish of a non-homing device mechanism you would say is the more serious effect of this parasitism. I think they just want to get rid of it, and so they're studying immune mechanisms. Yeah. Maybe they're working towards a vaccine. Who knows?
Actually, this is the last sentence in the paper. Yeah. Nasal vaccination may be an effective way to prevent aquatic parasitic diseases. And we know for viruses, they certainly vaccinate fish. They'll take the little fish and boom, 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 inject them.
Look at that.
Daniel, did you like this paper?
So I have to say, as I went through it, I started to get a little suspicious, right? And it wasn't until figure 8 that I was like, okay, now I'm coming on board. And I say that because so I'm gonna get you guys together here to figure 3B, where you see they're looking at the IgT and they're comparing it to the IgM response, and they actually have to cut the bars because boy, you look at the right. I mean, the IgT is down here at about 20. As opposed to 5 to 20. And then the IgM response, you're up here at 100, 200, 300, right?
Yeah.
And so then they do this interesting stuff where they say, well, okay, that probably looked a little fishy to Dan Griffin because it's somebody for me.
No pun intended.
And so they start doing like, and again, this is relative expression, right? So this is like 5-fold versus 10-fold versus 200-fold. And so they even kind of sort of mention this in their discussion. Well, boy, there sure is a lot of IgM relative to IgT, but that's just because maybe there's these little breaks and the IgM is spilling out from the serum, but it's really not as important as IgT. But then when they actually get to figure 8, where they're actually doing the proliferation, when you compare the controls and the survivors, you don't really see much of a difference in IgM, but it's actually the IgT producing B cell proliferation that you see in figure 8 actually having this connection with the survivors. And then when you look at the Western blots in figure 9, then you really see, okay, yeah, here's the controls. Yeah. And then you look at the survivors. The survivors, you're seeing really nice IgM and IgT expression. So my only quip with them would be that they're pushing hard on the IgT, but apparently IgM is significant here as well. So sort of suggesting we have a little bit farther to go here before you just say it's all about IgT.
They have a good diagram of what's happening. There are villi in the nasal,
right,
olfactory area. It's not just the gut that has villi. So these are nasal villi, and the responses tend to be at the tips of the villi. Mm-hmm. The production of the antibodies is quite interesting.
Right. It's possible also that IgM is harder to secrete because it's a conglomerate, it's a polymeric molecule.
Yeah.
Whereas IgT is more akin to IgA. And the peace protein is to what I was led to believe in the old days that you're now calling that something else. Isn't that the part of the heterodimer or homodimer, excuse me, that sticks to the mucus? Isn't that what traps?
Sticks to the poly-IgA receptor, I think. Yeah, and it brings it in. It's cut off when it's secreted.
Oh, I see.
Secretory peace.
Yeah.
But it is interesting to think about the surface area of the olfactory apparatus. And, if you think about it in a human being, just sort of to give people a sense, you think about, my nose, how big is the exposed surface area when I'm smelling something? And what always disturbs me, and I work in the hospital, I smell lots of bad stuff. And it was occurring to me this morning when I walked into one of the rooms that it's an area of about 10 square centimeters of my nose that is exposed to the world. And the way I smell things is actually direct contact, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's a big area for our immune system to protect. And it's about 10 square centimeters. It's a big patch of real estate.
That's true.
Anyway, I thought this was cool, a different system. And Dickson, it combines your two passions, fish and parasites. What could be better?
This is a Christmas present. I can't believe it.
They said
Christmas. Be nice to Dickson, but you didn't have to be that nice.
Happy Christmas, Dickson.
Well, I feel honored that you should pick it. I really enjoy
But also, I think fish parasites are pretty neat. We don't cover them very much, so.
We don't. So.
There you go.
Now, we can read from our list of heroes.
We got a hero now.
We do.
Last time we had a lady.
We did.
So now we're going to have a guy, and then we're going to alternate, right, Dickson?
If you'd like, we can do it that way. We have a superhero in this case. This is a gentleman. His name is Patrick Manson, later to be called Sir Patrick Manson. Born 1844, died 1922. They have absolutely placed him on a pedestal with regards to the development of tropical medicine, modern tropical medicine, and rightly so, to the fact that you can now go to London, and I forget the name of the street. I think it's Philip Morris Street, but I'm not sure. Daniel, do you remember where Manson House is?
I do not know.
Because it's the British Society for for Hygiene and Tropical Medicine that has their meetings there, and I've been in that building, and the bas-relief edging along the top of the walls just before you get to the ceiling, there's probably a name for that, architectural name for it, is a depiction of all of the parasites that Sir Patrick Manson worked on throughout his life. And it's a beautiful, beautiful building expressing homage to this gentleman's contributions. So I'll just read what it says here. Patrick Manson was stationed on the island of Formosa today the modern Taiwan, as a medical officer. During that time, he cared for a number of Chinese patients and became familiar with a wide variety of tropical infectious diseases, including lymphatic filariasis. He showed that culisine mosquitoes were the vectors of this nematode infection and speculated that human malaria was spread in the same way. This was the basis for Ross's work in India, culminating in his discovery that bird malaria was transmitted by the same kind of mosquitoes. Manson also described 2 new species of helminth that cause human infection that today bear his name: Schistosoma mansoni, which is a trematode, and the juvenile infection Spirometra mansanoides, which is a cestode. Manson went on to become identified as the founder of modern tropical medicine. So he, in the view of many, and you could write pages on his biography and books about his exploits as a medical officer. So we pay homage to the founder of modern tropical medicine.
Wonderful. Thank you, sir. Dickson.
You're quite Thank you.
Now,
it was a pleasure reading that.
For what everyone has been waiting for, a new case study.
Exactly.
Okay.
Have at it.
All right. So I've been, as we've been doing this episode, I've had several in my head that I've been thinking about. So what I want to do is I'm going to do a case that I saw here in the office right before I left for Uganda, and then I'm actually going to give you some Uganda cases, right?
All right.
Cool.
Okay. So I'm in my office. It's interesting. My dad always makes this distinction between an office and a clinic, but I'm not sure I know the difference. But so I'm in my fancy private practice, and this man comes in and he sits down and he has a lesion affecting his nose. Right. So this is here we are in Long Island. And I say to him, so what brings you in? And he says, well, it's a really long story. And I respond back with, so you've got X. And he says, oh, I guess it's a short story. So what he tells me is he's been having a problem with his nose for about 2 years. And this is a man in his 40s. And he said that the first thing he noticed is he's a surfer, and he was surfing and he whacked himself in the nose with the surfboard. And then he noticed after that he started having occasional blood and scabs coming from the nose. And when he looked, he noticed sort of right at the inside of the nares, there was a little bit of a scab that had formed, which he, figured, well, it's probably from getting hit with the surfboard. But time went on, and it seemed like this problem was not improving. Maybe it was getting a little bit worse. And so he finally went to see an ear, nose, and throat doctor on the South Shore of Long Island. And they looked inside his nose and they said, yep, you hit your nose really hard with that surfboard. Let's schedule you for some reconstructive surgery. And he said, Doc, well, what's going on? You hit your nose so hard that the entire septum is destroyed. There's no septum left. And he said, what, Doc? He said, yeah, when I look inside your nose, there's no septum left. It just, you can see from side to side. You really got to be more careful with your surfing there. And so I'm going to, any other questions that you guys
Where was he surfing, on Long Island?
No, he actually owns a surf shop and a little bed and breakfast. So he was surfing there.
Well, what country was this in?
Oh, interesting. So yes, it actually turns out his little bed and breakfast is in eastern Costa Rica, about an hour north of the Bocas del Toro archipelago, where I like to go to work.
Cool. Cool. Very cool.
But he's originally a Long Islander.
Got it.
Oh, yeah.
But he has actually spent a lot of time down there. He started going down there seemingly as a teenager. So any other questions that you might want to ask about?
Nope. We just avoided a very long series of questions.
Wow.
So I asked him a little bit more. And I say, there's some common diseases down there where sometimes people will get like a lesion on their skin somewhere else, related to what I think that you might have here. And he said, about 20 plus years ago, I had a lesion, a non-healing ulcer on my left hand. And after it had not healed for a while, I went and saw a physician down there. He took a scraping at the edge, put it on a slide, said, here's what you have, and then gave me these injections in my behind for about 20 days. And then the lesion on the hand went away.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Fascinating. As Spock would say.
Yes.
That's all you need to tell us, really. Everyone should get this.
A little bit too much information here.
Everyone should get this. If you've been listening to TWiP, if
true.
not, start listening.
This is true.
In medical schools all over the world, this is the one you want to do, right?
This is exactly right.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel.
So I guess here are the questions. One is, what do we think he's got? Two, should we let him go ahead with the scheduled reconstructive surgery next week? Or should we do something different?
Should he move his surfing location? Interesting.
All right. So I hope people like this. I thought
I'm sure they will.
All right. It's great. Thank you. And then afterwards, the next episode, we'll do a Ugandan case.
We'll hit a few Ugandan cases.
Very good.
Fabulous.
All right. That's TWiP 163. It happens to be the last TWiP of 2018.
It is. Do we have New Year's wishes for everyone?
For everyone who are listeners or ourselves?
Listeners and us too. We're listeners. Every time we're not talking, I'm a listener. Trust me, I'm not asleep. I just close my eyes to rest them.
I'm not complaining.
Actually, I always did this when I taught here to the medical students. I said, every time I finish the last lecture to this course, I always hope that the situation the following year is better than it was this year. And invariably, and I taught here for 38 years, it was worse the next year. As the populations grew in these areas of high endemicity, the situation worsened rather than got better, even though the medications were available and that sort of thing. It's just delivery and awareness, and and that's why I guess Daniel and I feel so strongly about this subject, because for different reasons, we both feel that getting the word out is the important thing, and this is what this show does. Mm-hmm. So my wish is that all of our listeners will realize that in order to have this continue, that they should probably consider some kind of support, financial support for us. As little as $1 a day or $1 a week or $1 a month, it'll go a long way to help.
$1 a minute.
$1 a minute would be fabulous.
I'm just kidding.
But I mean, I think that we have to make our annual pledge now, and it's a wish that our passion can be matched with their financial backing so that we can continue this and spread this to the next generation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great wish, Dickson.
Oh, thank you.
I would endorse that wish.
That's how I feel.
And you can go to microbe.tv/contribute to see how you can help us. Like if you want to give $1 a month, that would be great.
Yep.
A lot of you do, for which we thank you. Many of you give more, for which we thank you.
Yes.
And many of you give a lot in one batch, which covers many years, for which we thank you also.
Right.
And so that would be great. Thank you, Dickson.
You're welcome.
And if you want to subscribe to TWiP, you probably already are if you're listening, but subscribing would really help us. It's free. Just go to your app on your phone or tablet, and when you're on TWiP, just hit subscribe button.
Exactly.
Help us a lot. And of course, if you want to guess to see what's going on in these cases, or if you want to send us an email, we like getting both. TWiP@microbe.tv.
Right.
Daniel Griffin's at Columbia University Irving Medical Center, parasiteswithoutborders.com. Thank you, Daniel.
Pleasure as always.
Dickson Despommier at Racaniello.org, thelivingriver.org. Thank you, Dickson.
It's always a pleasure.
Happy New Year to you both.
And to you, and to you.
And to you all, a good night.
It's been wonderful. No, it's been a wonderful year. We had a wonderful year. It's not necessarily the wrong thing. The other thing I wanted to say about fundraising is that for most public stations, they disrupt normal programming to fundraise.
Mm-hmm.
I would never, ever consider doing that.
What do you mean? They stopped doing and they talk for an hour about fundraising?
That's right.
That's why I stopped listening to NPR.
Yeah, me too.
And I started listening to podcasts.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Because I just turn it off. It's just so negative that we don't want to dwell on it, but we can't help but mention it at this point.
Absolutely. I am Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.ws. Thanks to ASM for their support and Ronald Jenkins for his music. You've been listening to This Week in Parasitism. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon. Another TWiP is parasitic.